Today's lecture is the Hans Angress Memorial Lecture. It's underwritten by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. It's also the first lecture named for somebody whom I knew personally. So Hans Angress was born in Berlin in 1928. His family fled Germany in 1937. When attempts to reach the Americas proved unsuccessful, Hans's family settled in Amsterdam, which was safe haven for only 2 years. Hans' father was arrested in 1941. He perished in Auschwitz in 1943. Hans' older brother, Werner Tom, managed to get to the United States in 1939, where he enlisted in the Army, served in the 82nd Airborne Division as an interrogator, was one of the so-called Ritchie boys. Hans' survival and that of his older brother, Fred, was in the hands of his mother. When Fred got a call in 1942, along with 2,000 other young Jewish persons to report for work in Germany, his mother refused to let him go and obtained a job for him with the Jodsarat, the Jewish Council. My colleague Johan has just told me how to properly pronounce that. I hope I did it justice. This exempted all three from deportation. Hans studied at the Deutsche Lyceum, the Jewish school where Anne Frank was a fellow student. In September 1943, the few remaining Jews in Amsterdam were scheduled to be deported to the east. With the help from the Dutch resistance, Hans, his brother, and his mother found hiding places until the end of the war. He stayed with the, I should have asked Johan how to pronounce this, the Kooi family, K-O-O-Y, who were ultimately honored by Yad Vashem for their heroic conduct during World War II. At the end of the war, Hans moved to the United States and eventually settled in Marin County. Hans was a regular speaker in a lecture series, and on at least one occasion, he taught a discussion section. He died on November 11th, 2021, the day after the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht. We're sure that Hans' memory is a blessing because it makes possible today's lecture. So I'm now very pleased to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Rena Victor, who is a retired preschool teacher and who was born in Hamburg, Germany. Her mother lost her entire immediate and extended family, except for one cousin, in the Holocaust. After fleeing the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, she went into hiding with her mother and two sisters for 2 years until the war ended in 1945. She was not able to leave Germany until 1951. Her non-Jewish father was drafted into the German army and worked for the underground to try to save Jews. Rena later married another Holocaust survivor. While she believes each survivor's story is unique, being a child of a mixed marriage, her father was not Jewish, gives her a unique perspective. And then standing beside me is Rena's daughter, Dr. Susan Victor, who is Professor Emerita in the Department of Curriculum Studies and Secondary Education at Sonoma State University, where she has taught and is teaching, you can never retire here, adolescent development and classroom management to future middle and high school teachers. Prior to that, Susan taught in the Department of Secondary Education at San Francisco State. And earlier in her teaching career, she taught high school German. Susan did not hear about her family's experiences until she was in her 20s. She is on the board of the Alliance and chairs its education committee. She's also co-president. And then sitting at the table is Dr. Davita Lesch, who recently earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Light Institute in Berkeley. She works as a psychologist at Napa State Hospital. She is also an associate board member for the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide and currently leads the 3G group for third generation descendants.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you, my friend Eric Angress, who's Hans's son. He and his sister do many presentations in the schools to honor their father and mother. We're here representing 3 generations of a Holocaust story. My mother survived the Holocaust, as Stephen said, as a child. I was born 15 years after the war ended, 9 years after she left Germany. My father immigrated in 1949. I'll tell you a bit about his story in my part. Davita was born 30 years after that in the early 1990s. We're sharing with you today our process of what in German is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which translates as to come to terms with the past. The word Vergangenheit means past, and Bewältigung has sort of a connotation of wrestling with. The German language is amazing and rich and beautiful, really, and I know it seems strange for a Jew and a daughter of survivors to say that, but I love the language, and it has a way of taking a process, an experience, and forming a compound noun out of it. And the word Vergangenheitsbewältigung was coined in 1945 to describe the process in Germany, and here's someone who can help me with that, of reckoning with German collective guilt, of engaging with the process of denazifying essentially Germany, and creating a memory culture, a place where memory of the Holocaust would eventually become public, and we'll talk more about that. But the 3 of us are kind of helping ourselves to that word today, in order to kind of tell you our stories, and maybe after you hear all 3 of us today, you'll understand more why that might be. It's a story about 3 generations and their relationship to the Holocaust, but it's also to some extent about the German Jewish identity. As you've heard Stephen say, my mother had a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother. My father had a bit confusing. My father had a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, and I'll explain more about that later. So we're quite identified as German Jews, although, as I'll also talk about, that identity really doesn't exist anymore. I've been coming to the lectures pretty much every week, and I note that what we're doing today is a good transition from a couple of questions I think 2 of you asked last week. You asked of Dennis about the effects on him and on his son, I think. Weren't those questions last week? Yeah, of the Holocaust. So I loved what Dennis's wife talked about as she described what their son did. So I think this is a good transition for all of you from that, because that's indeed the goal of our presentation. My mother and I spend a lot of time every school year in middle and high schools. She presents to classes probably 8 or 10 times, reaching hundreds of middle and high school students. Recently, and for the first time, the 3 of us actually presented together to a high school, the entire school, 150 students. The night before we presented, I had this dream where my mother and I were in a train station somewhere here in California or in the US. And we got to the station, and all of a sudden the signs in the station became DB, the Deutsche Bahn, the German train. So suddenly we were in Germany, and the manager, whatever you call him, the person who takes care of the train station, I can't think of what they would be called, station manager, I guess, came up to me and asked me in German if I knew any survivors. And I said, yes, well, my parents are survivors. And he said, good, because they need to talk to these people. And I look behind me, and there's like a good 100 American high school students on a field trip. Isn't that wild? And I thought, okay, well, that's what we're doing. That's what I told the kids in that school this dream. And I said, well, that's what we're doing today. We're taking you on a journey into the past in Germany. But I'm not sure that's actually all what the dream is about. I'll leave you with that. I'm going to show slides for the 3 of us, and my mother's going to get us started.
Hello again, and my name is Rena Victor. I'm honored to speak in the lecture series again. I live in Marin County and am a retired preschool teacher. I left Germany in 1951 after surviving the Holocaust and 6 years of post-war reconstruction in Germany. I'm here to tell you the story of my family surviving the Holocaust in Germany. Since I was a young child during that time, my recollections and memories may be mixed with what my mother told me. I know you heard another survivor story last week. It is important to remember that every survivor has a unique story, and every survivor experienced the aftermath differently. I have had the honor of speaking to many hundreds of students in grades 5 to 12 and college over the last 18 years. I try to connect my story to what students are reading or learning, to current events and to their own lives, in the hopes they will stand up to racism and anti-Semitism. I ask that they, and you too, consider Elie Wiesel's words about being a witness. He said, I believe firmly and profoundly that whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. So those who hear us, those who read us, must continue to bear witness for us. I know you're familiar with the events leading up to the Holocaust, how Hitler came to power, and the history and the nature of anti-Semitism in Germany. As you know, there were essentially two wars going on in Germany, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war with the Jews. My story takes place in this context. The experience of German Jews was unique, as this quote from Yad Vashem describes well. German Jews defined themselves as both Germans and Jews. Life under the Nazi rule thrust most of the Jewish population into a severe identity crisis. Germany, the homeland whose values and cultures the Jews had adopted, was rejecting them. We, myself, my daughter, and my grandchildren feel both German and Jewish. But it became a complex identity, obviously, after the Holocaust. And in a sense, an identity that no longer exists in Germany. We are comfortable speaking and hearing the German language, unlike most survivors or children of survivors. We have returned to Germany several times, although those trips are not easy. First, a brief history or reminder of the events leading up to the Holocaust. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany after consolidating the roles of President and Chancellor, following the burning of the Reichstag and the death of Hindenburg. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. These 400 laws severely limited the rights of the Jewish people and how Jewish people could live their lives. First and most significant, their citizenship was taken. Jewish people could at first only go out, for example, to the market at certain times. There was a curfew just for Jews. They had to go to the back of lines. They had to give up driver's licenses. They couldn't be doctors or lawyers or teachers or hold any kind of public job. They couldn't marry non-Jews, which is an important part of my story. They couldn't even have pets. They couldn't go to school. They weren't allowed to walk on the sidewalk. Eventually, they couldn't keep their homes or belongings and were forced to move in with other Jewish people, often complete strangers. These places were referred to as Judenhäuser or Jewish houses, which was a temporary method of marginalizing and segregating and ghettoizing Jews in Germany, typically prior to their deportation. I will mention Judenhäuser later again. November 9th, 1938 came Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, a night when Nazis smashed windows of stores in Jewish neighborhoods, destroying approximately 7,500 old businesses and hundreds of temples in Germany and Austria. Many people were taken away, including thousands of Jewish men, adult men ages 16 to 60. 10,000 of whom were from Hamburg, where I lived. It marked the beginning of the end for German Jews. In March of 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. I was born 2 months after the war started in November of 1939. Here's some background about me that is important for you to know. I was born in Hamburg, which is, as you might know, a large harbor city in northern Germany. It is the largest city in Germany with a population of close to 2 million. My mother was Jewish, my father was not. They married in June of 1935, just before the Nuremberg Law was enacted, which would prohibit their marriage. I almost died as an infant. The Nazi doctor told my father to just let me die, and my father threw him out of the house. I had two older sisters, pictures of whom you saw on the first slide. My father owned a grocery store in a Jewish neighborhood called Grindelviertel in Hamburg. These are pictures of Grindelviertel, including the Hohenplatz synagogue, the largest in Hamburg, which was destroyed on Kristallnacht. My father's store was vandalized by the Nazis, who painted on it like "Don't shop in Jewish stores." The tires on his delivery truck were slashed. He was called to the Gestapo after he physically stopped the Hitler Youth from vandalizing his store and was given 14 days to close it. Friends started avoiding my mother. They crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. A close friend since childhood all of a sudden stopped talking to her. Her circle of friends diminished and then became non-existent. One time, some Hitler Youth harassed her and her mother, calling them terrible things. My grandmother, who was a very proper lady, swore back at them, shocking my mother. She said, "Man muss mit denen reden in der Sprache, die sie verstehen," which means one must speak to them in the language they understand. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandfather had strong feelings that Jewish people should assimilate and should be able to live wherever they chose to. Apparently, he would approach Orthodox Jews and ask them to not be in public in their religious clothing so they wouldn't stand out. He committed suicide in 1929, 10 years before the war started. My mother was 17 and her brother only 7. My uncle was still in public school where the students were led in terrible songs about killing Jews. An example, wenn das Judenblut vom Messer springt, which means when Jewish blood springs from the knife. He was forced to leave and attend a Jewish school, pictures of which you see in these slides. In 1942, that school was closed, as this sign shows. The students were deported and the principal and all the teachers were murdered by the Nazis. This is a picture of the Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, placed in front of the school for the principal and the teachers. I will talk more about this later. We were very worried about the safety of my grandmother and uncle. They were forced to leave their apartment. The Nazis confiscated the apartment and all their belongings, and they came to live with us. My father, who was a German soldier by that time, thought he could protect my grandmother and my uncle. But eventually the Nazis took them away in November of 1941. My mother actually had to bring them to the deportation site, which is unbearable even to read now. When she saw what was happening, she tried to hold on to them. My uncle was only 20 years old. From the information my daughter and her husband researched, we heard that they were gassed in a truck on the way to Minsk in Russia. Tragically, his girlfriend's family was able to leave to the United States and had wanted to take him with them, but he wouldn't leave his mother and sister. This slide shows the documentation of their deportation and deaths from the Yad Vashem database. Susan will tell you more about this. My father had to join the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. Again, there were 2 wars going on. Hitler's War of Expansion and Hitler's War on the Jews, and many others. Like many or most non-Jewish men, my father was drafted. During his time as a soldier, he helped in the underground or resistance by getting the names and addresses of Jewish people whom the Nazis were going to pick up. Because he was in the Air Force, he actually had to fly Nazis. There's a story about getting the Nazi generals drunk while his friend, an artist named Hermann Koller, was asked to paint their portraits. My father and the artist would take advantage of this and attempt to get information to pass to the resistance. He had a small book with notes of this information. One time he dropped it in a hotel room. A maid found it and returned it to him. He could have easily been arrested and killed by the Nazis if she had turned him in. He was arrested once in Belgium and beaten for information, but was released due to a lack of evidence. He had also been arrested or summoned previous times and told he had to divorce my mother because she was Jewish, or summoned previous times and he told he had to divorce my mother because she was Jewish, which he refused to do despite the risks. The injuries endured in prison affected him his whole lifetime and probably contributed to his death in his early 70s. Two of his brothers were also involved with the underground, were killed by the Nazis. This slide shows my father in uniform at the graveside of his brothers, as well as the portrait the painter did of my father. After the war, my father was involved with efforts to track down Nazis. In summer of 1943, my mother was summoned by the Gestapo to come to the Rathaus, City Hall. This probably happened multiple times. She was told by the SS officer that they had a letter from my father that he wanted to divorce me because he didn't want to be married to a Jew anymore. My mother knew they were lying and said, "I have to see that letter for myself." The SS officer claimed that he didn't have it but would get it. But in the meantime, she would have to stay at City Hall and clean all the floors. Every time she was summoned, she brought me and my sisters with her, this time as well. So she responded she couldn't clean the floors because she had her children to watch. The officer said something like they would watch the children, which was, of course, frightening. My mother then took her right hand out of her pocket, a handwork on which she had only these two fingers because the three had been lost in an accident when she was 3 years old. Essentially, she shoved the hand into the officer's face, saying she couldn't clean the floors because of this injury. The Nazi officer may have been shocked, or maybe he felt sympathetic, but he let her go. Hamburg was bombed by the Allied forces for 10 days and nights during Operation Gomorrah. To survive the bombing, we had to go into a bomb shelter, which was typically in the basement of apartment buildings like the one we lived in. Every bomb shelter had a Gauleiter or area leader appointed by the Nazis. This Gauleiter would not let my mother into the bomb shelter because she was Jewish. He was willing to allow the three of us because our father was a German soldier. The night we were bombed out, the neighbors and in the apartment building essentially forced him to let my mother in. We don't know for sure how, but they either beat him up or killed him. Before fleeing our demolished apartment building, my mother threw her identification papers that showed she was Jewish and the yellow star Jews were forced to wear into the fire. As Hamburg was burning, we were evacuated by train with almost 1 million other people to Hof, a small town in Bavaria in southern Germany. As we fled, my mother carrying me and holding the hand of my sister and one bag which contained a change of clothes and some photographs. A woman offered to carry the bag. We don't know if she took it or it was lost in the crowds of people running, but that was the last we saw of it. All we had left were the clothes we were wearing, and my mother wore 2 pieces of her mother's jewelry, which you see in this slide. That is all we have now. When we arrived in Hove, we were herded into a big school gym, where the residents of the town could look at us and decide to whom to offer shelter. We lived in the attic of a Nazi woman who thought she was sheltering the family of a soldier. Her sons were also soldiers. This was incredibly scary for my mother, as the woman had no idea that she was Jewish. She had to lie, for example, and say she couldn't leave us when the woman wanted her to come downstairs and listen to Hitler speak on the radio. She would say, Sie müssen kommen, der Führer spricht, you must come, the leader is speaking. My mother sent letters to everyone she knew in Hamburg in the hopes my father would find us and realize we were alive, that we had survived the bombing. She also sent him a telegram. We are fortunate to have the original copies of these documents, which you see in this slide. In the meantime, my father returned to Hamburg to find our apartment building destroyed. He left this note on the building. Who knows where my family is? These pictures were in a book about the Jews from Hamburg. Und nicht zuletzt ihre still courage, and not the least their quiet courage. We ran into one of the friends who got a letter from my mother and let him know where we were. He was able to get leave and come to home. Apparently, he brought the woman some coffee, which was a valuable commodity. After securing a hiding place, friends who lived on a farm outside of Hamburg sent my mother a telegram instructing her to return. Because the trains were not running on any schedule, my mother took us to the station every day until we could get back on a train to Hamburg. We realized then it was no longer safe for us and we had to go into hiding. A friend of my father's had a farm in Meindorf, Rahlstedt, outside of Hamburg. They were hiding other people who were at risk of arrest due to their political views and actions. Here we stayed for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945. We lived in a shack that my father was able to send because he was in charge of securing and setting up prefabricated buildings for soldiers. For those 2 years, we had no water, no heat, no electricity. My mother and the elderly man who lived on the farm helped make beds for us, and she sewed sheets together and pillows which she stuffed with hay. I remember we had to sleep in our shoes, and always someone had to be on the lookout for the Gestapo. The friends never told the neighbors that my mother was hidden there, only they were taking care of 3 German children of a German soldier. My mother could never risk leaving the farm. I'm not sure how we got food, but we were able to plant some vegetables. And the woman got us children some food with ration cards. My father sent some coffee he got on the black market, which the woman was able to trade or sell for food. My older sisters walked to a well for water. At the end of the war, we were quite malnourished and thin. They also raked some electricity from the main house. And my mother listened to the radio, and she could follow the war news, which was of course dangerous. In April of 1945, we hear that Hitler died and know that the war will be over soon. Suddenly, one day, my father showed up. Once he heard Hitler had died, he left. And we moved back to Hamburg and attempted to find somewhere to live. Hamburg, as you saw in an earlier slide, was almost totally destroyed by the bombing. So it was very hard to find somewhere to live. We lived with other survivors, then with a friend of my mother's. You see in this picture, who let so many people live in her apartment. Someone was even sleeping in the hallway and the kitchen. For a short time, we were given a house to live in that the Nazis had taken from a Jewish family who never returned. I'm not sure where else, but several places with several people. Every day, my mother listened to the radio because they would read the names of survivors of the concentration camps. She desperately listened for any family member, but heard only one cousin's name. Later, my mother will realize only she and this one cousin survived. More than 50 members of her family were killed by the Nazis. She did hear the name of a friend who was the daughter of the principal at the Jewish school I had mentioned earlier. The Jewish school from which all the teachers and principal were killed. My parents went to pick up this friend from Dachau, where she had been and where both her parents had been killed. We were very poor and had nothing after the war. Also, the anti-Semitism persisted. My oldest sister, who had returned to school, even heard it from teachers. People looked at us and wondered and even asked why or how we survived. The same friends who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw my mother coming now tried to convince her to sign papers claiming they had not supported the Nazis, which she refused to do. Because our parents had no money and had to get their lives together, we three sisters were moved into a home provided by the Warburg family. The Warburgs were a German Jewish family living in the United States who donated their home in a neighborhood north of Hamburg for Jewish orphans and children who had survived the war but maybe had no family, or the family had no money or stable home like us. This gave me and my sisters shelter and food, a community, and a safe place to be Jewish. There were many of these children's homes throughout Europe after the war. While my sisters and I were at the children's home, my mother, who now was on her own, worked desperately every day on immigration to America. It was awful for her to live in Hamburg those 6 years, not only because of the rubble and ruin everywhere, but because she always looked over her shoulder, afraid and wondering if that person was a Nazi who had killed her mother and brother and the rest of her family. These are pictures in a notebook in which you can see some of her notes about leaving, including a list of names of relatives who lived in Illinois, from whom she hoped to get help. The process of trying to get a visa to come to America was extremely difficult, adding insult to painful injury. Once at the American consulate, the officer said to her, "Well, you weren't in a concentration camp." My mother responded, "I probably wouldn't be here if I was." My mother was an incredibly resilient and brave woman, and here are two stories that illustrate that. I want to share so that illustrate them. One day she was driving and she was stopped by a police officer who asked for her license, which she didn't have. She said to the officer, "At the start of the war, the Nazis took my license from me. Now I'm waiting for them to give it back." He let her go. He also refused to wait in line, for example. And once at a post office, she went to the front of the line. When people complained, she said, "At the start of the war, you wouldn't allow me, as a Jew, to stand in line with you. Now I refuse to stand in line with you." It was something, unfortunately. He continued to do here. We have to keep reminding her that this is still. My mother was an incredibly resilient and brave woman.
Hast du gelesen?
Oh, das habe ich schon gelesen.
Ja.
Oh ja, oh Gott. Sorry, people, students. In order to get to America, like now, people had to have a sponsor, family or friends in the United States who could provide an affidavit of financial support. It was a long time an effort to convince our relatives in Illinois to provide that. My mother had an uncle, her father's brother, who had been willing. Sadly, he died. Then his 3 sons weren't sure they wanted to help us. Finally, one agreed to sponsor us, but only if my mother brought only one of her 3 daughters. I was the youngest, so my mother made the devastating decision to leave her 2 older daughters. It was very, very hard to leave my sisters and my father, who also remained in Hamburg. One sister came a year later, but the other not for 4 years. I did not see my father again until I was 31, and my daughter was 11, which was the age I was when I left. The slide shows a picture taken of me with my parents, and Susan was the age I was when I last saw my father. It was the only time I saw him in 31 years. He came to visit us in the early 1970s. He died shortly after this visit. The feelings associated with this separation never left me or my sisters. This separation was something we never fully healed from. We immigrated to the United States with tickets paid for partly by the relative in Illinois. It was not easy here either. I had to confront prejudice against Germans when they heard my accent, and anti-Semitism, along with the racism faced by African Americans. There were signs of public schools. Schools, I'm sorry. In New York, for example, that read no Negroes, no Jews or dogs allowed. My mother had to quickly find work where she also faced anti-Semitism. She could not get hired by several insurance companies, for example, because they would not hire Jews. I had to go to public school, not understanding or speaking any English. And no teacher prepared to support the needs of refugee students. A few years later, we moved to Southern California, where I attended high school and then married another survivor and had 2 children. Susan will tell you more about her father. This is a picture of my mother's immediate and extended family at a wedding in 1922. We got this picture from one of the cousins in Illinois. My mother could not tolerate having it in her apartment. It was just too painful. Only 2 family members in this picture survived, as I told you earlier. Only my mother and 1 cousin. The picture has hung in Susan's house since her wedding in 1991. The names of the family members are written on the back. Germany has taken responsibility and made efforts to make the history of the Holocaust public, to display reminders outside where everyone can see them. The Stolpersteine can be seen as an example of making the memories public. There are currently more than 90,000 of the stumbling stones that you see in this slide in 1,200 locations in 30 countries for victims of the Nazis. There are approximately 5,000 in Hamburg. There are small brass plaques on top of cement blocks installed in the sidewalk or driveway at the last known residence of the victims. It is important to note that it has to be the last known residence, not a Judenhaus. So after doing the research to find that location, it's challenging. My sisters and I had 2 placed for our grandmother and uncle. This is a picture of the artist Günther Demnig in an article about the Stolpersteine titled Steine gegen das Vergessen, which means stones to fight forgetting. On the back of which my oldest sister wrote the instructions for having ours installed. Every time we or my daughter or grandchildren go to Hamburg, we visit the Stolpersteine. In fall of 2021, one was installed for my first husband's grandmother, with whom he was very close as a child. My grandson, Micah, began to do the research during his junior year of college in 2017 to have this Stolperstein installed. The pandemic led to delay in 2022. Susan and her son went to Berlin to see it 5 years after he began the research. Regina Victor, who had been in a Judenhaus after she was forced to leave her home and belongings. So finding her last resident was challenging. Susan will tell you a bit more about the visit to Regina's Stolperstein. The artist Günter Demnig says the goal of the stumbling stones is to recover the humanity and identity of victims. He also explains how important it is for young people to know and remember the history by seeing it everywhere, to remember that even in the land of Dichter and Denker, poets and thinkers, this could happen. The social justice lawyer Brian Stevenson talks about the Stolpersteine as partial inspiration for the lynching memorial in Alabama. There are other public memorials throughout Germany, like a railroad track listing deportations, and signs on stores that had been owned by Jewish people prior to the war. Unlike most survivors, I have returned to Germany a few times. As I mentioned earlier, I have some non-Jewish cousins still there. And as a German Jew, I still speak German, as I mentioned earlier, although it is upsetting that sometimes Jewish people get uncomfortable when they hear my accent or hear me speak German. I still feel somewhat connected to Hamburg, although I would never live there again. I have been invited to speak to high school students in Germany, in Hamburg, and in Leer, where my father was born, to students who had never met a Jewish person. I returned to Hamburg in October of 2022, exactly 100 years since that wedding picture was taken. Here's a picture of my cousin and I visiting the Stolpersteine. It is not easy for these German cousins to talk about what happened to us, so his coming with me was very significant and important. Last November, I went to Hamburg and to Amsterdam to visit my grandson. He took this picture of me in front of the house where Anne Frank was hidden. I like to share these quotes from her when I speak to middle and high school students. Despite everything, I believe that people are really good at heart, and the young are not afraid of telling the truth. I believe that too. This quote from Elie Wiesel explains what the Holocaust and my experience means today, why I talk to students and why my daughter and grandchildren know and help me share my story. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Thank you.
I want to transition from my mother's presentation to mine by showing you these numbers, along with a lovely picture of my two children, the Stolpersteine. I'd like you to take particular note of the first and the last numbers. Before the Holocaust, before World War II, there were approximately 17,000 Jews living in Hamburg, which is now the second largest city in Germany, as my mother mentioned. By the end of the war, there were only 1,268. Sometimes I think when we hear numbers about the Holocaust, it's almost they're just too big, right? They become abstract. And this way, I think when you picture a city, a home place for so many people, when you look at the numbers, there were 1,268 left, including my mother, my father, her two sisters, her mother, and one cousin. When I teach about identity, I teach adolescent development here for teachers. As Stephen mentioned, we talk about identity formation, and I like to tell them about what I call the two chairs dilemma, identity dilemma. It's when it's hard as a teenager to sit in two chairs at once, right? You're trying to sort out how you're this and how you're that, or how you hold two identities at the same time. You know, for me as a German Jew, as a teenager, and even now at 66, I don't know how to sit in both those chairs anymore, because they don't exist. The identity, as you can see from these numbers, doesn't exist. So what happens when an identity isn't allowed? As Stephen said in his introduction, I've been a professor in the School of Education here for almost 30 years. I actually retired in the summer of 2023, but they never let you leave here. I think Stephen said it's like Hotel California. I don't know. I still teach a couple classes a year, but my volunteer gig, which I'm so grateful to have, is that I'm the education chair I'm the chair for the education committee of the Alliance, and my primary task is to help prepare an amazing group of speakers for presentations in middle and high schools. And it's a job that's really not a job. I'm not paid for it, but that's not the point. It's a privilege and it's an obligation I gratefully fulfill. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is not the identity I brought to my work here as a professor, an identity I treasure. But for the 30 years I was here, I was busy teaching, and I was busy being a parent of two. And I would see the lecture series posters and think, oh, I should be part of that. I should be involved with that. But I had to keep it at a distance. I told myself I didn't have the time, and it wasn't why I was here. But it was and still is very hard to bring this deeply personal thing I'm about to tell you about to this place. So I'll apologize in advance that I probably won't get through it without crying. We started the semester with a living room dialogues, and since then I've been thinking about my part of this 3-generation presentation and how it emerges from 3 conversations or exchanges. One in a kitchen with this woman in the picture, one on a couch in the living room, and one around a dinner table. These conversations in my childhood, my adolescence, and my emerging adulthood years led to 2 stories that I'm going to share with you. One is mostly complete, and you just heard it from my mother. The other one is incomplete, fragmented, and dark. It fits more into what Columbia professor Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory. Here is her definition. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. To experience that they, quote, remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and so affectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. So a kitchen, a couch, and a dinner table. Anyway, my story as a daughter of Holocaust survivors begins with those conversations in the kitchen, on the couch, at the dinner table. The first one takes place when I'm 12 years old and I'm watching my grandmother, my mother's mother, cook dinner. Warum denkst du, kommen sie so spät? She asked me, referring to my parents, which means, why do you think they're coming so late? My parents both worked long days and had long commute. This was the first time she spoke German to me. That was the start of my lessons, and not just of German. Prior to that, at times I heard she and my mother speak German, but never my father. 4 years later came the first trip to Hamburg at the age of 16 with my maternal grandmother. We had come to Hamburg to move my paternal grandmother, my father's non-Jewish mother, into assisted living. As my mother mentioned in her presentation, my 2 grandmothers were close friends before they became my grandmothers, but then they were my grandmothers. Yeah. And that friendship required that my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, make the trip she never wanted to make, to return to Germany. I recall the looks on my Jewish grandmother's face, anger, fear, panic, all of which confused my teenage mind because, as my mother described, her mother was strong, bold, resistant. She went to the front of the lines. She dragged my little girl hand with her to the front of lines everywhere. That trip was followed by 4 more I had to take alone throughout my adolescence and college years to see my father's mother, because he never did never dared to return to Germany. His mother was not Jewish and was actually the daughter of Otto Schoenfelder, who you see in this picture. Otto Schoenfelder was before the war the mayor of Hamburg, and then after the war he became the president of the Senate. He actually helped craft the basic law for the Federal Republic of Germany, together with Konrad Adenauer. His daughter, my paternal grandmother, obviously remained in Germany after the war. I always wondered, but was never told, why my father never went to visit his mother. As summer would approach, he would ask me, "Will you go see my mother?" Which of course I could not say no to. I would spend most of the 3 or so weeks sitting at my grandmother's bedside, as for various unexplained medical reasons, she had taken to her bed in her 60s. It's clear these trips cemented an identity with that place, with Hamburg, hence why I call it mein zweites Heimat, my second home. It pleased my German relatives very much when I said that. I realized how scared I was to take those trips. As much as Hamburg felt like a second home, it also felt scary, like I wouldn't be able to leave. I still have that feeling. None of my relatives ever spoke to me about my family, or the half of my family being Jewish, or about the Holocaust, or what happened to my parents and my maternal grandmother. At home, nobody did either. We celebrated Christmas and Easter. There was always palpable fear present of people in uniforms of official-looking male. These are two pictures of my father, this one right after he was liberated and just in his later years. My father watched World War II movies frequently. He often looked distant and preoccupied. He suffered many health problems, including the inability to eat anything with fat in it, butter, meat fat, the yellow of eggs. At dinner time, we would all wait to make sure he could digest the food. Here's the memory of the dinner table conversation, but it was not a conversation that the people present, especially my brother and I, could participate in, because when he would say with anger, "You people have your food," he was talking to people who weren't there. My father's father, who was a somewhat well-known communist Jewish writer, fled Germany in 1935 for Switzerland and then New York, abandoning his half-Jewish sons at ages 10 and 12. I studied German for 9 years in high school and college, including taking a class about the writer Heinrich Heine. In the class, the professor was obviously thrilled when he read my last name because he had read my grandfather's books. The C I unfortunately got in that class was mortifying. An aside here too, on a lighter note, I went to Berkeley in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Everywhere you walked as a student, the campus was full of people trying to get you to join things or sign things. I accidentally joined the campus Communist Party. Just signed it. The guy wouldn't leave me alone. I was 18. I don't know. And in my fear of what that might mean or what might happen to me, I told my father what I did. He screamed, which did little to assuage my fears, but of course made great sense given his own fears. The year I turned 23, the living room couch conversation takes place. My father was diagnosed with cancer, and knowing I assumed that he wouldn't have long to live, sat me on the couch, and what I recall is a 10-minute conversation told me about the circumstances of leaving Germany. His primary motivation in telling me was concern that his brother, whom he didn't entirely trust, would distort the truth. I remember very little content of that conversation, but I recall feeling completely immobile with the serious tone of it. He didn't talk directly to me that much. I remember seeing the stunned and worried faces of my mother and my grandmother in the kitchen. I think my mother said, "You're telling her this?" He died a year or so later, 1 month before his 60th birthday and 2 weeks after my 25th birthday, 41 years ago this month. The threads that follow from these two conversations tells you what it means to me to be a daughter of German Jewish Holocaust survivors. My mother and her mother's story became an integrated, increasingly cohesive part of my personal and professional identity. It coalesced into a purpose I can hold on to as an educator. I became a German teacher in the 1980s. In an act of love that surprised me, my father translated my credential program's professor's letter of recommendation into German to send to his mother. This is what you see on this slide. I still find it hard to read the whole thing. I think he was genuinely proud of me, but that was a striking, overt expression of pride, and the thing he chose to praise was my mastery of the German language. even more striking because he never spoke German. In my first teaching job, I had a student who defined as a neo-Nazi, a student the principal warned me about before the school year started. He drew swastikas on his work. When I asked him why he was taking German, he answered, to learn the language of the master race. In his evaluation of my teaching, the principal mentioned the incident and my identity as of Jewish heritage. I think what I perceived as the principal keeping my Jewishness at a distance bothered me more than the student's behavior. To be honest, that student taught me the necessity for unconditional teacher love that I tried to pass on to my teacher credential students here. After 40 years of silence, my grandmother was willing to speak to students, first to my high school classes, then later to classes of my education students at San Francisco State, where I taught before coming here. How hard this was for her is reflected in this story. I brought her to present to an 8th grade English class taught by one of my student teachers. As she began, she seemed to lose her composure and hesitate, which was very uncharacteristic of her. I took her out into the hall. What's wrong, Min? I called her Min. Held back tears. She never cried. She said, I didn't know they would be so young. Why should they hear this? That moment was especially poignant for me, given what I teach. To protect vulnerable adolescents was more compelling to my grandmother than telling them the story of her pain and loss. Here is a picture of one of the last years I suspect my father was in school. I believe around 8th grade. I keep this picture on my desk along with him at a desk in his first hotel management job.
That was the Taft Hotel in New York.
Thank you. It was a Taft Hotel in New York where he spent his career in hotel management. It reminds me that despite how much studying I have done, he learned by, among other things, reading the dictionary. One time home from college, my freshman year at Berkeley, he opened the dictionary where his bookmark was and asked me if I knew the meaning of a particular word. When I said no, he said, "What are they teaching you at that school?" In my later 20s, I joined second generation groups where I experienced marginalization as a German first Jew. One member actually said to me, well, your family probably didn't think it would happen to them. I read Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust. I could only read a few pages at a time because my heart raced and I felt faint as I read stories of my life mirrored in the lives of other daughters and sons of survivors. I recently reread the book, the 2019 edition. In the introduction to the new edition, the author wrote that the book, quote, served as a validating and normalizing text for thousands of sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors, as well as other genocide survivors. I noted in both the 1979 and 2019 editions, I underlined descriptions of a father survivor at dinner time. The scene painfully familiar. At 27, I interviewed my mother's mother, who spoke honestly about her survivor guilt before we had a name for that. That same year, my husband and I poured through big hardcover books at Yad Vashem listing deportations and found her mother and brother. The page was titled November 14th, 1941, Transport nach Minsk, Transport to Minsk. She was relieved to know at least what happened to them, although now I don't know how she went on living. I got a hint of that when Davita was born. She was beginning to struggle from cognitive decline, even returned to only speaking German. My mother brought her this empty book to write in which she wrote why Davita's birth was so important. I was thinking a lot of the family. There is the lovely Davita, 10 days old, and the great-grandmother, 81 years old. That's really something. We are having a large family now, and I am still here. By that point, age 81, she was the only one alive from her family since the cousin had died at age 68. In my early 30s, I married the son of a German Jewish refugee who's here. I had a Jewish wedding and had the privilege of raising 2 children. My husband and I have been careful to tell the Holocaust story consciously and deliberately, hoping to avoid or minimize third-generation trauma. Davita will speak more about that. That couch conversation, the 10-minute conversation with my father, has to this day left me with dark words. He'd often muse at the dinner table. The best exercise I ever got was digging graves. And dark sounds, and his frequent nightmares. And dark actions, how he screamed when we wasted food, his obvious fear of die Behörde, officials, whether in uniform or in the mail. His fear of leaving this country, which he never did. Hamburg, to which I have returned 6 more times since age 23. so 12 altogether. While still at Zweites Heimat, a home leads to weeks of sleepless nights as I approach the trip. The first 24 hours or more, sometimes paralyzed with fear, as I said, that I won't be able to get out. Dismay that my children, even as adults now, have had to see that. The thread from that conversation on the couch is fragmented and dark and unclear and raw and full of gaps and still hard to talk about. But what we've been able to find out from some of my father's documents, which my mother had, you see on these slides, this is his identification on which he tried to cross out the swastika. This is documentation proving where he had been. He had been arrested at the age of 18 in 1944 by the Nazis following his older brother's arrest and imprisonment for anti-Nazi actions. He was in solitary confinement for 6 weeks at Fußbüttel prison in Hamburg, and then once they realized he was half Jewish, was transferred to Ohlsdorf-Neuengamme concentration camp, where he spent more than a year. He was indeed forced to dig mass graves. His health, notably his eating problems, may have stemmed from starvation and then from eating rich fatty foods too quickly after being released. These were compounded by his whole life by symptoms of PTSD, which of course we didn't know about. His brother was sent to Buchenwald. He also survived, but the way he coped with the effects could not have been more different, and that ultimately affected their relationship, I think, and my father's lack of trust in his brother. In order to get restitution, which in German is interestingly called Wiedergutmachung, another compound noun which translates as to make good again, in order to get the reparations, the restitution, you had to prove you had been persecuted. So we have this paper from him. I think you can read. These are his immigration papers when he finally got here. I notice it's dated 24th January 1950, 10 years to the day before I was born. I was born January 24th, 1960. It's an interesting coincidence. This is, we went to see Neuengamme, my husband and I, many years ago. And in the book, I see there's information on the transport of prisoners from Fußbüttel prison. I don't know if you can see where the arrow is. And then it says Leichenbergung, which means the burying of bodies. So we found out that's what indeed he had to do. A couple of pictures of the prison and the camp. My father's father returned to Germany in 1948 and was embraced by this is a picture of him and my father meeting him, holding the suitcase. He was embraced by the East German communist government. His efforts to rebuild a relationship with my father were understandably rejected. This picture is very painful for my mother and I to see, as my father greets his father's ship after all he had went through, and he's holding his suitcase. I don't have the letter, unfortunately, but I recall my father getting a long letter from his father, apparently full of his political views. Nothing I imagined about what happened to his son. My father wrote Scheiße, which I'm sure you know what that means, in big letters across the letter, and I think he sent it back. An aside about this picture here with the photo album, you can see some pictures missing. It's a page out of a photo album. My paternal grandfather wrote over 100 books, and he was quite well known in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany. After his death, his widow gave all his writings and documents and photographs to the Akademie der Künste, the archives in Berlin. In 2019 and 2022, my son and I spent hours looking through these archives. When we came across this and other pages from a photo album with photos obviously missing, I remembered quite suddenly that in 1988, my husband and I had visited Weimar. This was a year before Germany's reunification. We stayed in the house where his widow still lived. He had died. The house which was returned to its rightful owners after Germany reunified. My grandfather's wife was reluctant to let me take any pictures. So full of resentment that this man had abandoned my father as a child, leaving him to suffer in a concentration camp as a teenager, I got up in the middle of the night and just took a bunch of pictures, including the two from this page. Well, both my grandfathers died when I was 12. I remember my father getting the letter from his brother on stationery outlined in black, which I guess they used to do, informing him of his father's death. He cried briefly, but said nothing. My son and daughter have bravely and compassionately tried to continue to piece the story together, story of our family, and more importantly, let those stories inform the kind of work they do and how they do their work. I'm not sure, honestly, they had a choice in that. My daughter, as you heard in Professor Bittner's introduction, started our grandchildren group and is a gifted therapist working with severely mentally ill adults who have been traumatized. My son is a lawyer working for an organization that seeks reparations for victims of genocide and war crimes around the world. In his junior year of college, as my mother mentioned, he researched what happened to my father's grandmother, with whom he was close as a child, with the goal of installing a Stolperstein for her. Here, these are some pictures of that. She had died in Theresian, Regina Victor. What my mother didn't tell you is the story of what happened when my son and I went to see the Stolperstein. Now, right after this picture was taken by my husband, we stood up and just were looking at the apartment building, which had been rebuilt. And a man walked up and he said, "Was machen Sie here?" Apparently he lived in the building. "Was machen Sie here" means, "What are you doing here?" And, my German's good. And I spoke to him with the formal you, and I explained what we were doing. And he got very angry and said, "Why do we need to have these here? My parents," I think he said, "were killed by the Russians." And it went on. And as much as I tried to comfort him too, and say, well, maybe we need to do something for your parents, or I don't know. And we were going in circles, and my son had just said, "Mom, let's forget it. Let's just go." And then a woman comes out. She lived on the top floor of that same building. She comes out on the balcony, calls him a really terrible but lovely name in German that I won't repeat. I can tell you later. And says to him something like, "You need to go back to school. You need to read your history books. This is our history. Of course, we have to have these here." So that was amazing. But my son and I got on the bus and we cried. And all I could hear in my head was my father saying, "Well, you can't go back." I revisited that feeling just a few months ago in October, by seeing efforts to rebuild the Jewish community in Grindelviertel. The trips to Hamburg still feel like paying homage or visiting a cemetery. In fact, most of Northern Europe feels like that. Any city we travel to, inevitably we seek out the former Jewish neighborhood, the destroyed synagogue, or the Holocaust memorial. We walk looking down so we don't miss a stumbling stone, or we go to a Jewish museum showing the historical path of a people that ends in their disappearance. While obviously a privilege to be able to travel there is a grayness to everywhere, making being a normal tourist impossible. Indeed, during our last trip last October, I went to Grindelviertel, to the school in Hamburg where my great uncle went, and all the teachers and principal were killed. When my husband took this picture, a police officer who appeared to be, I think, in his 30s, approached us, asking us why we were taking pictures. When I told him, he said over and over again, "Es tut mir leid, es tut mir leid, es tut mir leid," reminding me how the process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, reckoning with the past, is ongoing, and yet it's complicated for his generation. In a New York Times article that Davita will mention, there's a quote comparing the first and second generation. Quote, "If a chasm opened in the lives of the first generation, they could nonetheless sigh on the far side and recall the life before." The novelist Melvin Jules, the son of a survivor, wrote in 2001, "But for the second generation, there is no before. In the beginning was Auschwitz." Before turning it over to Davita, I want to close by saying I remain not fully at home in either identity, because I said earlier the bicultural identity of German Jew doesn't exist anymore. I have German relatives I love, but even after seeing the Stolperstein, my cousin asked me, "Why actually did your family leave Germany?" I love the language, but as my mother said, we hesitate to speak in front of other survivors or children of survivors. I love Germany, but read in horror about the rise of the AfD. I learned enough about Judaism to raise our 2 children with holiday rituals and rites of passage, but Germany is still more a homeland than Israel ever could be. Both identities are regularly indeed called into question. My Jewish identity, for example, when my Alliance email was flooded with more than 100 emails from Jews evoking the Holocaust and the survivors who founded this lecture series, in which they criticized the inclusion of a Palestinian scholar in the series last year, not considering that they were tormenting this daughter of Holocaust survivors with their emails. I don't identify as a Zionist, nor am I observant. I care more that my daughter and son marry good people than necessarily Jewish people. I'm very slow to label something as anti-Semitic, since my parents and grandparents suffered as a result of true anti-Semitism. I don't want that feeling. I believe as an educator that the lesson of the Holocaust, especially for students, is a lesson about human cruelty and human suffering, as well as human resilience of any people. I don't believe that the Holocaust or genocide education is only ours. After a recent trip to Hamburg, I had some brief thoughts about returning, because I'm actually German, to be part of the emerging Jewish community in Grindelwald. But I imagine it would feel like a cousin of my husband's, whose house in LA stood while all the houses next to him were burned in the fires last year. I can't tolerate the Holocaust being used by Jews to justify their political views or actions, yet admittedly, I embrace protest signs that say ICE is like the Gestapo, or one I saw recently with a quote from Anne Frank, "They're dragging people out of their homes." Well, I only had that 10-minute conversation on the couch. I know my father would be both terrified and distraught at what is happening to immigrants in this country now. I was recently reading about diasporic, which for me defines a Jewish identity that travels and settles in a place for how long it is allowed to contribute and integrate. Perhaps the only places the German and Jewish identities come together in a meaningful way for me is when I walk in Hamburg or Berlin and see the Stolpersteine, or I'm sitting at a meeting of the Alliance members, the other speakers, and sensing the thread that connects us, the next generations. Elizabeth Rosner, whose father survived Buchenwald, describes our experience well when she writes in her book, Survivor Cafe. We keep trying to name what we are carrying, attempting to transform it into something beautiful, something healing, something that cannot quite be let go of, not quite be held on to. Even now, the notion of naming myself according to the near-death experiences of my parents strikes me as both a puzzle and a certainty. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna try and follow my incredible grandmother and mother, but so my name's Davita. I am the daughter of Susan and the granddaughter of Rena, and I am gonna speak about my experience as a third generation descendant and the ways in which my understanding of what it means to be a grandchild of Holocaust survivors has shifted and taken new meaning throughout my life and my education. I'll start from the moment I can first remember, knowing that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, to now as I try to make sense of what it means to be a third generation descendant. So growing up, my mom never really spoke to us about the Holocaust. At least that's what I remember. I do, though, remember at some point having a picture in my mind of the shack that my grandmother hid in. I pictured a dark wooden shack in a large field far behind a farmhouse with flowers all around it, because my great-grandmother let my grandmother and her sisters plant them. I pictured shelves like bunk beds on the walls inside the shack where my grandmother and her sisters slept, and I pictured my great-grandmother sleeping on the floor with a small radio next to her. Of course, I didn't know what the shack actually looked like, besides what was described to me, but that was the image I had in my mind as a young girl. And for many years, this is how I pictured where my grandmother was during the war. But I didn't have an understanding of all the horrors of what that were happening around her, and I for sure didn't understand what her story had to do with me. The first moment that I remember, though, was in my 8th grade English class. We were reading The Diary of Anne Frank, which I'm sure many of you have read, and my grandmother came to my class to tell her story. This was the first time she had come to speak. By then, I think I knew a bit more about what happened to my family, yet I don't think I was able to completely connect my family's story with the story I was reading in Anne Frank's diary. How could I connect the chapters that I was assigned to read every night and subsequently write reflections onto my grandmother's story? I couldn't yet grasp at this age they had both been through the horrors of the Holocaust, that they were both in hiding, that Anne didn't survive and that my grandmother did survive, and that she was standing in front of my class telling that story. It was just too complicated. Yet, while she was speaking, I had squeezed my tiny 8th grade body into a small desk chair with my friend Maddie, who was the only other Jewish girl in my class. I think something in me knew I was supposed to be sitting next to the only other Jew. Maybe she was attempting to understand this part of her identity just as I was. The next moment was in my 9th grade English class. We were reading L.A. Bell's Night. And at this point, my grandmother had told us the story in more detail, or my mother had told us the story in more detail. For this book project, I decided that I would make a collage of images of old documents and tell my class what I then knew and understood of my grandmother's story. I recall my mother using this opportunity as she handed me document after document to photocopy and glue to the large piece of cardboard to explain what happened in more detail, knowing I was a bit more ready to hear it. As she handed me documents, she translated them from German to English for me. I just remember thinking, how could she have these documents? And how could I be touching these papers all these years later? How could I be touching the same paper that my grandfather wrote on? And how could these documents have survived? This large three-fold poster board that I created became covered in old black and white photos and documents, all had yellowed, most of which had yellowed with age. And there was a photo of the shack where my maternal grandmother with her 2 sisters and mother hid in Germany during the war. One of the documents had verified that my grandfather had been forced to dig mass graves in a labor camp, as both of them spoke about. Also displayed was a picture of his passport with the swastika on it. and it was evident that he'd furiously scribbled over the swastika as if trying to erase the memory. The collage was titled Generation to Generation, and I recall my 9th grade classmates looking at me in total disbelief as they understood how close I was generationally to the events of the Holocaust. After the presentation was over, the collage remained standing in front of the fireplace in the home where I grew up. My grandmothers who survived and my ancestors who had not were both a living presence in our house long after the presentation. I knew fragments of their stories, yet what I came to understand later was that I was infused with an experience that was really just unformulated, and maybe it even defied knowing. The next moment I remember was in my 10th grade world history class. So when I was in high school, we all kind of decorated our binders. We were an expression of who we were. It showed the sport that we played, the hobbies we enjoyed, and the quotes that made us feel better, and drawings of our favorite animated cartoon characters. So my lime green binder, I remember, was covered in flowers, Snoopy on his doghouse with Woodstock perched on him. My mom had taught me how to draw that. Positive quotes and sayings about gymnastics, because I was a gymnast for many years. And I remember sitting in my 10th grade world history class and looking at my brightly colored binder, and then over to the desk of the boy sitting to my left and down at his dark black binder. And there on the cover of his binder was the drawing of a swastika. And I knew what that symbol meant by then, and I also understood that a high school boy in Germany would never risk the careless misuse of the symbol of a symbol of this horror. In fact, it would be illegal to have it on his binder. I don't remember if the teacher ever noticed or said anything about what was drawn on his binder. The next moment was in 2012 when my family and I took a trip to Berlin and Hamburg. This was the first time I'd been to Germany. My grandmother already spoke about the stumbling stones, or the Stolpersteine, which are small brass bricks that are raised slightly above the ground so that one literally stumbles over them and looks. So like she talked about, thousands of these stones are placed in front of the former homes of Holocaust victims throughout Germany as the government's way of preserving the memory of the victims and assisting Germans to come to terms with the burden of the Holocaust. So on this trip in 2012, instead of stumbling upon them as one is meant to do, we came purposefully to an address in Hamburg, Germany, where 2 of these brass stones that were engraved with the names of my mother's great-grandmother and great-uncle were placed. I remember standing there trying to imagine my great-grandmother watching as the Nazis forced her mother and her brother into a truck to be taken away forever. Though the reading of the stones should have really only taken a few seconds, I just remember we felt compelled to remain there for several minutes, bent over the stones, looking at them, touching them, feeling the loss of what they represented. And I stood by and watched my mom bend over to touch the stones, and I imitated her gestures, as though we were kind of both cradling just the stones and the people and the memories. I think this was the first moment I recognized that the Holocaust was both a historical and a very personal event. And I realized I was in a physical place, which confronted me directly with the history of my family, a history that I had until then only understood through the distance of books and stories and pictures, and that despite the horror of the past, some part of me belonged in this place. During this same trip, we went to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, and I observed how the other visitors viewed the displays with solemn respect. Yet they had headsets on and shopped in the gift shop and chatted about which site they would visit next. While my brother and I took in the reality of this history that was ours and watched my mom in her discomfort quickly rush through it. We were not afforded the luxury of viewing the displays from a distance as though we were tourists. The stories we knew and the feelings associated with them prevented that degree of detachment. I don't think I anticipated that this trip would become a marker on my path of understanding my cultural identity as a Jew and as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. While I had by this time heard stories about my grandparents and great-grandparents, and I'd written about them in school papers, I had never walked where they had walked, and I had never experienced their history in this visceral way that I did when I went to Germany. And it was strange to pose for photographs earlier in front of the children's home in Hamburg, where my grandmother and her sisters lived, which she spoke about at the end of the war. We posed like tourists because the building that had sheltered 200 lost and grieving children had become a site in a guidebook. Although here, the life my still living grandmother had lived was on display for tourists, I had to respect that these places functioned for German as a public forum for grieving, an acknowledgement of the obvious historical burden that they carry, and an unabashedly direct owning of responsibility for the events of the Holocaust. And I remember thinking then that moving forward in my life, as I went to college and into adult roles, that I would take this history with me that I experienced firsthand in Germany. And that as a descendant of the victims of this horror, I felt like I was obligated to live the life that they could not, to pursue the education that they could not, and to make the choices that they could not. The next moment happened during my first year of college. I enrolled in a Holocaust and film class. I have no idea why I did that, but the assignment was to watch Holocaust films and write a brief reflection on it. I remember lying in bed, my laptop propped up on my knees, and turning on the film. Within the first 10 minutes, there were black and white images of the Gestapo herding hundreds of Jews into tiny square buildings, images of frail, terrified Jews being forced to line up as the Gestapo yelled in their faces, and images of the gas chambers and Jews digging graves. I remember slamming my laptop and running into my mom and saying, "This is what happened?" Of course, I knew by then about the concentration camps and the gas chambers and the 6 billion Jews who died. But being asked to watch a film about it as though it was just history, as though it wasn't my family's history, I couldn't bear it. I don't think I had the ability to separate myself from the images and continue watching the film, so I dropped the course. In 2017, I went with an ex-boyfriend, who we're not going to talk about, to Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. I remember watching how interested he was, reading the signs and learning about what happened there. I remember standing there in horror and just counting down the seconds until we could leave. I honestly could not bear to be there, standing in the same place with thousands of Jews who were killed. I just remember it was so freezing and desolate and awful, and I couldn't wait to leave. The last moment in my story happened during a trip to Europe last fall when we went to the annex where Anne Frank was hidden in Amsterdam. This is the place where she and her family hid and where she wrote the pages of her diary. I spent time squeezing my way through huge groups of students and tourists with headsets on, listening to audio recordings telling Anne Frank's story. For them, this all happened so long ago and so far away, but as my grandma would say, it's like it just happened yesterday. And for me, it's still too close and still too personal a story to look at as though it were another tourist attraction. My younger brother is a lawyer and is currently working in the Netherlands to help victims of genocide get reparations. He spent a semester during his undergrad years in Berlin and then returned again for a month to spend time reading my family's archives as he wrote his honors thesis about the Judenhäuser. My brother, the brilliant man that he is, has taken more of a historical direction in attempting to make sense of this horror. He has sought to find answers in the historical research and perhaps seeks to find healing and repair and redemption of life in helping refugees. Each time we spend days with my grandmother when my brother's home, my brother asks her questions about her story and her family's history. He knows exactly what to ask and how to ask it, and listens with such presence and intensity, and can connect each detail to the next and piece it all together as she talks. And I sit there in awe as the two of them discuss her history and her family's history in great detail. I'm honestly in awe of my brother and the way he can approach it. Well, it's really hard for me to even look too much into the historical details of it all. Maybe I don't want to know that much. Maybe I don't want to face the details of the atrocities against Jews and against my family. For me, it feels a bit unbearable. So I think my attempt to make sense of it all honestly feels a bit different. Like him, I know the importance of understanding my family's history by putting the pieces of it all together and retelling it at every opportunity. But rather than attempting to find answers in the way my brother does, I've tried to understand the story through the lens in which the trauma of it all has impacted our family for 3 generations. So since I've become a psychologist, I've attempted to understand the ways that the Holocaust, well, through grad school and since I've become a psychologist, I've attempted to understand the ways that the Holocaust has impacted my ancestors, my grandmother, and her descendants psychologically. And I've attempted to make sense of the remnants of trauma within each of us. So throughout grad school and now in my career, I've begun to develop a more 3-dimensional understanding of the impact of the historical transmission of historical trauma. These ideas have helped me begin to understand the incomprehensible. Writers, theorists, psychologists, and researchers have tried since World War II to define the trauma that survivors themselves experience. The book, I should have brought it because I have it, but the book Emotional Inheritance by psychoanalyst Galit Atlas talks about the legacy of trauma and asks, how do we inherit and hold and process the things we don't remember or didn't experience ourselves? What is the weight of that which is present but not fully known? We inherit family traumas, even those we have not been told about. The inherited feelings of the parents and the grandparents' unprocessed traumas are phantoms that live inside them, the ghosts of the unsaid and the unspeakable. It is those ghostly experiences, not quite alive, but also not quite dead, that we inherit. They invade our reality in invisible ways. They illumine, leaving traces. We know and feel things, but we don't always experience their source. After World War II, psychoanalysts first began examining the impact of trauma from one generation to the next. Many of these analysts were Jews who had escaped Europe or whose parents were survivors themselves. In the 1970s, neuroscience validated psychoanalytic findings that survivors' trauma, even the darkest secrets they never talked about, had a real effect on their children's and grandchildren's lives. In the 1990s, studies were focused on epigenetics, in which scientists analyzed how genes were altered in the descendants of trauma survivors, and studied the ways in which the environment, and especially trauma, could leave a chemical mark on a person's genes that is then passed down to the next generation. Other studies revealed that offspring of Holocaust survivors have higher levels of cortisol, a hormone that helps the body bounce back from trauma. However, it was found that descendants of people who survived the Holocaust have a different stress hormone profile than their peers, predisposing them perhaps to anxiety disorders. This leaves them more vulnerable to carrying symptoms of trauma that they didn't experience firsthand. In a New York Times article that was published to coincide with the movie A Real Pain, titled "The Holocaust Grandchildren Are Speaking Now," the author writes about the experience of the third generation, stating, "They know something is important to them and affected them, and it's their story too. But they're not aware of the things they didn't experience and are almost hesitant to take ownership." My very close friend and colleague, Dr. Rebecca Feuerstein, researched intergenerational resilience and post-traumatic growth in grandchildren of Holocaust survivors in grad school. Her dissertation was titled "May Their Memory Be a Blessing: Intergenerational Resilience and Post-Traumatic Growth in Grandchildren of Holocaust Survivors." And it explored three main themes: resilience across generations, connection to and identifying with survivor grandparents, and Jewish dimensions of resilience. She found that grandchildren of survivors saw a pattern of strength in how grandparents coped and often echoed these qualities. Her research also found the dynamics of resilience and post-traumatic growth in third generations may be influenced by four factors: the way grandchildren see themselves in the shadows of their grandparents' stories, the sense of obligation or indebtedness to their legacy and their ancestors, the relatability of the survivor, and the need to find an identity of one's own in light of the magnitude of having a survivor grandparent. She asked, how do we see ourselves as resilient and strong when someone who has been heralded as the strongest, the survivor, is in front of you? Dr. Feuerstein also explored the sense of ownership third generations have over their grandparents' story and posed the question, how do we as grandchildren own a story that's not ours? In a similar vein, Bay Area psychologist Dr. Sam Gershon, when speaking about intergenerational trauma, writes that Holocaust descendants often feel like they are possessed by a history they didn't live, or they're mourning a loss that's not their own. So currently, I have discovered that much of what was experienced by my relatives has been shrouded in silence and numbing and fog. And I think since I was younger, and until now, I've spent time trying to look for meaning and shapes in the fog. What I do know is the effects of the Holocaust reverberate through my family, and it lives in the air that we breathe. I'm sure many of you have heard stories from your grandparents or your great-grandparents, and sometimes they're not clear, or you can't even imagine what they're telling you because it feels so far away from your own life, or you can't even imagine that something like that happened to them. That's how I felt when I was younger. And while these events are still nearly impossible to imagine, I think I've tried my best to understand the psychological impact that it all had on my grandparents and the generations that followed. I do think that it's nearly impossible to draw a completely solid thread from my family's experience of the Holocaust to my decision to become a psychologist and to my development as a psychologist. But what I do know is that being a psychologist felt like a moral imperative. And I felt, and I still feel, driven to repair or redeem life in some way. In my work, I strive to relate to my patients' pain and find meaning in their disguised and incomplete stories. The Elite Atlas writes that as psychologists, we try to follow the signs and listen to not only what our patients say, but also their pauses, attempting to collect recollections of their childhood, of what was said or done, listening to omissions, to stories untold, looking for clues, piecing these together into a picture and asking ourselves, what really happened and to whom? The secrets of the mind include not only our own life experiences, but also those we unknowingly carry with us, the memories, the feelings, and the trauma that we inherit from previous generations.
This is a question for all three of you, but how has time and proximity to Germany changed your perception of being a survivor?
Like, for example.
No, I don't think it has changed me too much, really, if any. It will just always remain a part of me and of my family, and it's something that I live with, really.
I think the speaking in the schools has
Yes.
made an impact after my grandmother died or after she couldn't speak in schools anymore. You know, my mother picked it up 18 years ago or so. Yeah. And I think there's a way where we were talking about this, like it's very hard before and it's very hard after. But my mother's also a retired teacher, right? During those presentations, I feel like we're completely present with the kids, with the students.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and really treasure the interaction with them, the
Yes.
questions, and so in some ways that's helped. There's something
Mhm.
about that that's
Mhm.
helped, I think, no?
Yes.
Yeah, like
But I
gives
think
purpose.
students always help
Yeah.
children.
I think that's given it purpose. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Speaking for you, but
How has the sharing of your story between you three
see?
How has the sharing of your story affected the relationship
Between us,
between the three of you?
I think it has broadened our relationship. We always knew what happened to my mother's family and to my family, but we didn't really talk about it. But since Susan has been doing it, the first time I ever delved into it was at College of Marin. I took a class, and then the students didn't believe I could have possibly been there during the Holocaust. But in any case, I think it helped us really understand our past, and I think we always had a good relationship, but I think it deepened it even more. And now with my granddaughter,
One thing that's hard about doing this, I'll just say, is there are pieces of the story that I did share today, also ones I don't share because I don't want my mother to feel so much pain around it, right? It was not easy being married to my father and watching him suffer. And so that's affected our relationship, making me realize, you know, it might take a while for me to be able to tell that whole story, that it's tempered by that. And my only sibling has suffered enormously as a result too, and we prefer not to talk about that. So I think that's, you know, affected our relationship, that we also have to address that, parts that we can't talk about.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that's, I think, something I've thought about is, despite us being a family of, you know, people who talk about our feelings a lot, and we're kind of forced to talk about things and put things on the table and share what we've been through and stuff, I think there is a lot of unspoken stuff. Maybe there's a lot of like silence or things that we don't always are able to maybe put into words. And I think that hearing the way my mom talks about her experience growing up, when she first learned about it, how she tried to make sense of it specifically, has helped me, you know, learn more about her and become closer to her in a lot of ways, really. You know, and I think I've heard my grandmother's story many, many times, but every single time I hear it, or like I spoke about, I listened to my brother and her go into the details of it, I'm like, I'd never heard that. There's another detail. There's another thing that I didn't know about her.
Is
Like I said, he's the best at getting all of the information out of her. So
And he was a history major, you people.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am incredibly proud to be like a part of this generation of women in my family. I wish my great grandmother was still here. As you saw in that picture, we were 4 generations for a couple years. So it was really, really special. But
I will always be grateful that she got to meet you.
Yes.
And at the end,
yes.
yeah, it just showed. Anyway, anybody else?
And please, I apologize if this is maybe too significant of a question, but is there any resentment towards the side of the family that was able to stay in Germany and exist for that period of
No.
time?
Well, no, you mean the non-Jewish
Yeah,
side?
the non-Jewish side.
So this is well,
It's a good question, yeah.
For a few years, my father was still there, and but
It's not Jewish.
his
You've never,
father was.
no,
Yeah.
no, Eric, you're not Jewish. I'll have to figure that out later, but you never felt resentment towards,
No,
I
not
don't
at all. Okay.
probably we'll have to sort out the family later, but so the cousins who are alive and with whom we visit are first cousins of hers, and their Eric's mother was your father's sister.
Right.
So that's how they're
Right.
not Jewish.
Yeah.
And then they have a daughter who's my age and we're very close. But Davita just whispered in my ear, there have been moments that I've had a hard time with, that I probably have stronger feelings about than my mother. They don't want to talk about it. They haven't wanted to talk about it. My mother's older sister talks about it all the time. And when she goes to see them, she makes them listen, and they really have a hard time with that. And they have complained to us about that. It's just hard. I think they don't want to hear so much about it, but that's the hard thing for me with the cousin, my generation, the daughter, is that like, I think she said to me out of the blue after a bottle of wine, said, so why did your family leave? Why did your father leave? I don't even know where to start. No, I didn't even know where to. And when we went to take her to the Stolpersteine, she said, well, who are these people? And that's hard. So it's the 2 chairs dilemma, right? When I go there, I have a relationship with her that's German. Because I want to have a relationship with her. And I think that's more intensified for my generation than with yours. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Tyler?
Oh, yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess like many questions would be difficult, and this probably isn't like the worst thing ever. But I was basically just, I'm being so dramatic. I was wondering about the differences between the 3 of you in terms of like the feelings about the prospect of or actually visiting Germany. If it's mostly the same or if it's different, you know.
For me, it is different. I have hardly any sentimental feelings about it anymore, and that might have happened in the last few years. I think I felt more closeness to the city, which we all like, when my father was still alive, or when now when I go, there's already nobody there. I mean, cousins.
To go off of what you were saying about your frustration, like with your family members, like how do we move toward getting people to listen to things that are hard to hear? Like, I feel like there's a culture in our society where it's like, oh, like, let's not talk about global events. Let's not talk about politics. Let's not talk about things that are like emotionally heavy. And I feel like those conversations are still important. These conversations are really important. But how do we go about moving in a direction collectively where we're able to conversations together?
It's not easy, to be sure. But I think fine.
I think what we do in the schools is a huge effect. We allow any question pretty much to be asked, answered. We're telling she tells almost the same story you heard. We alter it for the age group of that. But I think if adolescent students are watching people talk this way, I'm hoping that'll help as they move into adulthood, but I don't know if that's answering your question. There are about 25, 30 speakers in our group, and at our recent meetings, we meet 4 times a year as a group, and we've had some very, very rich and very difficult discussions about what's happened in Gaza, what's happening in this country. How do we do what we do without and sticking to our mission, which is educational and not political? How do we engage teenagers' questions without straying into the political? But it's been really such a blessing for me to just listen to the speakers and talk about that and wrestle with that.
For all 3 of you, how has the process of, I don't know how to say this word in German, but wrestling with the past evolved from a private family matter into public storytelling? Does that offer some sort of healing that wasn't possible for decades of silence?
I think it took a while, but because our tendency was as a family to keep it quiet. We just didn't talk about certain things, and it took a long time, and then I think it became cathartic. I think it helped.
I wish my father had lived longer. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know if he would have talked. I also think it's generational, that generation, fathers, Germans, I don't know, all that may have conspired to keep him.
Yeah, and as
Silent.
I mentioned in your story, I mean, he had so many fears,
Yeah,
and
I think that
he
generation,
fought it again.
he did.
And it just lasted a lifetime, really.
he never became a citizen, and that's a complicated story in and of itself, but he was very frightened. And I think my mom said by talking about it at all, including to me, and my brother would have frightened him too much. And I also think that generation of parents, what kept things from children, right? We
Because that's how
didn't
we
really
were.
talk to children,
Yeah,
yeah.
when we were children, for example, the saying, everyone should be seen but not heard, kind of a thing. So when adults came to visit, we were herded off to another room, and
I mean, I think it's forced us to have interesting conversations about what we're gonna share and what we're not gonna share. Also, we were talking about this, like, who do we share the Zoom link with? Like, do I share it with my colleagues? I don't know. Like, do I want them to know how, like, do I want them to know how my mom speaks about it and my grandmother's story and how I experience it? Like, yeah, why not? But also, like, I don't know. Like, so that's been a conversation too of who we tell about it.
Really.
Part of me is like, do I post it on my Instagram story? But I'm like, no, like, I don't know,
Right.
So, but that brings up just conversations of like, why? Like, why are we sharing this certain thing, but not that certain thing?
Right.
And what are we keeping private in the family and why are we doing that?
But it has to feel right, and
Yeah.
Sometimes when you talk about private things, that it may not even be necessary
Right.
for you to share that with an audience or with
And I think coming at it from like the purpose is education.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
And to
Yeah.
have these really important conversations.
Right.
That really helps me. I know that helps both of my grandmother and my mother, who are both teachers, So yeah, coming at it from that lens, I think, is really helpful. To
Absolutely.
think about what we're gonna share and not share.
There's something about this environment that is just inherently trusting to
Yeah.
me. I mean, I've spent my whole adult career in it, especially at this place. I love SSU, love all of you. Like this feels home, like home. But there's something when we're in a classroom of any age, like Davita just said, feels inherently
Special.
safe to do this, but not other groups of people,
No.
interestingly, yeah.
That's true.